Nick Jody, what is your reaction? Are we out of the crisis? We will have sustained growth in the stock markets?
Yeah, so let me try. No, I don't think we're out of the crisis. It's morphing and evolving. In 2008, the crisis was led by excessive debt in private sector and leverage. It has been solution or partially solution, but doing that, we have socialized the debt, increasing the large public and debt deficit, which is leading to the new form of the crisis, which is sovereign crisis. So I'm not going to elaborate. We have people who are more expert than I am on this subject, but from a market standpoint, capital market standpoint, it's driving a soft factor very important, which is confidence. It is the buzzword confidence. The way this crisis is going to be treated is still uncertain. It's being addressed aggressively in Europe, but it's driving lack of confidence from the market, which are sometimes a little bit schizophrenic, and therefore huge volatility. Number two, Dr. Schwab, we're still carrying in the system, and maybe we can discuss that later on, significant issues and systemic risk. I would mention a couple of them. In my area, I would say two big phenomena: opacity and over-fragmentation. Just 10 seconds on opacity. It's not a marginal phenomenon. On the equities market, opacity in the US and in Europe is 40% and growing. In the derivatives, it's 80%. In the debt market, it's 95%. So we are not discussing something marginal. It is massive. It is growing. And I really believe that we can fix what's happening without tackling this opacity. So that's one. I'm not going to elaborate on the side effects of opacity, but I could. It is devastating if we don't fix it. Over fragmentation, same thing. It's very difficult for regulators to control what's going on if the markets are over-fragmented. It is driving issues around inefficiency, valuation, investor protection, and systemic risk. I will mention one typical example, back to opacity and over-fragmentation, which is the clearing, which is a safety net for the planet in this area, which is a focus that we should all have. And last, to be short, I think that the regulators around the globe are doing a very courageous work, but it's requiring now an unprecedented level of coordination, which makes their task even more difficult. And a side comment on that is, by all means, we should avoid regulatory arbitrage. It would be even worse. Therefore, it's another call for regulators to cooperate and make sure that we will harmonize, streamline the regulation around the globe to avoid regulatory arbitrage. The last thing, and I will be done, is while we try to regulate, since markets have shown that they could not control the situation themselves, and we're still carrying significant risk in the architecture, we should avoid, however, to try to over-regulate and control any risk. The nature of economy in itself is about a little bit of risk-taking. The zero risk cannot exist, and we should prevent ourselves to go to a zero-risk policy. It cannot be done. So that would be my short answer, Dr. Schwab.
Thank you. Jamie, I'm sure you want to contribute from your perspective to this issue of are we out of the crisis? What is this remaining systemic risk?
Well, I think the obvious one comes to mind is to make sure we get through the European sovereign crisis first. I think the second is to make sure we have proper regulations and hopefully globally coordinated, though I think they'll be less globally coordinated than they probably should be. And I would say those are the major two that we really got to focus on.
Before coming to regulations and the possible also negative impact of regulations, I turn to the minister, and Minister Lagarde, I could compare you with the fire brigade. I mean, you, or even the chief of the fire brigade, you had a very substantial, crucial role in helping to avoid, let's say, the total collapse of the global economy. You You had a very decisive role in managing what we call the Greek crisis, the euro crisis. But my question to you is, we speak about systemic risks, and governments and banks are part of the system. So in your capacity as a member of the G20, being in the chair of the G20 next year, do you feel the banks are doing enough?
Yes and no. When I listen to bankers and very competent ones say that they want regulations, I think to myself, yes, they're doing enough because they're supporting the movement for better and more coordinated regulation, which I think is an absolute necessity. And there has been a clear change of tone. It was not so long ago that banks would say, forget the regulations, keep the politicians out of what we're doing, we know better, we can produce our own regulation, thank you very much. I think those times are past, and in that sense, the banks are doing a good job at focusing on what is the most appropriate regulations. I say no, because clearly they are under a duty to finance the economy. And as was mentioned this morning by one of them, very clearly and explicitly, banks have to go back to their core business. They have to raise deposit, they have to manage time, essentially, they have to lend to their corporate clients, they have to use and conceive financial instruments that will be helpful for their corporate clients in particular, and that's really the core of their business. And they should not, in my view, expand into a level of proprietary trading that eventually overcomes the rest of the activity and overshadows their sensible judgment. So in that vein, it's a yes and no, which is a Normandy response. Peut-être banque oui, peut-être banque non. But what I'm certain of is that we have, as was mentioned by Mr. Cerruti, we have to be absolutely coordinated so that we do not have little loopholes, we do not have arbitrage options available, because otherwise, you know, as certain as you're a man and I'm a woman, banks and the shadow banking players will move into those directions, which is why we need to be adamant and determined that all loopholes are closed and that we do not leave space for arbitrage countries, whether in prudential matters, which is bank regulations and bank ratios, or in tax matters, or in any kind of money laundering. And that's a big job to do. But I'm pleased, given that I've been a fireman or a firewoman for a while, to start being an architect with a lot of my colleagues.